More than 20 years apart, two marches on Washington were organized to fight for political and economic equality for African Americans and led to a successful civil rights movement and serves as a model for following movements. According to History's website, published on 2015, the March for Jobs and Freedom was expected to attract 100,000 participants, but 200,000 people showed up. What would life be like today if we didn't stand together and rally for what was right? Imagine where we would be across all spectrums of equal rights if people weren't brave enough to gather together and speak. Throughout my UNCG career as a student, I have researched a lot of civil rights issues. My research has included historical events that has shaped our nation. Throughout this research, I have discussed concerns with people that either have undergone adversity themselves or know someone who has. The March on Washington and subsequent events thereafter led to a call of action for African American rights and freedom. First, I'm going to discuss what led to the March on Washington and what life was like before the movement. Second, I'm going to tell you what occurred during the march and some interesting facts. Thirdly, I'm going to discuss the impact it has had on equal rights. We begin our journey by going over some events that led up to the march. There are many events that led up to the March on Washington, but life before that was very unfair. Even 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, African Americans in southern states still lived in an unequal world. Segregation and oppression was evident after the Jim Crow laws at local and state levels. The laws barred them from classrooms, trains, cars, theaters, juries, legislatures, and bathrooms. According to the website On History, on 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the separate but equal doctrine that formed state-sanctioned discrimination and drew a spotlight on African American civil rights. The second thing I'm going to tell you about what occurred during the march, and I'm going to state some interesting facts. There were technically two marches on Washington, and they were organized by two different people. The first march was organized in 1941 for 50,000 people to join by President of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, and his name was Philip Randolph, and he was the president of the organization. And he was persuaded to actually stop the march and to cancel it, which actually happened. President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an Executive Order 8802, according to the History's website, published in 2015, to establish the Fair Employment Practices Committee to investigate discrimination for defense contractors. The FEPC went out of existence in 1946, and it had a limited victory. The March on Washington was organized in 2 months by Bayard Rustin, and first was held on the morning of August 28, 1963, in Washington, D.C., according to NPR's website in 2011. The civil rights movement of the 60s changed the political climate and led to advocates' passage of the Civil Rights Act. Most notably, Martin Luther King Jr. called for racial justice and equality in his I Have a Dream speech. Interestingly, he spoke last, since nobody wanted the slot, and his speech was actually 16 minutes long, and that went over 12 minutes longer than the time limit. Now I'm going to tell you about what the impact of the march had on Americans. According to the History Channel website, regardless of the years that followed the dissolution and racial strife, the march was a long-term success. More than 200,000 Black and white Americans held a day of speeches, prayers, and songs. Both marches represented hope to restore faith in racial equality and their belief in the democratic process. At first, segregation of public facilities came to an end, but there was still segregation that persisted for many years. It wasn't until the 1970s and the 80s until civil rights movement gains were strengthened. The modern African American civil rights movement transformed American democracy, and the marches on Washington has served as a model for other group pride efforts, such as women, students, the LGBT community, and the elderly. Now we have a better understanding of the background and brief overview of the March on Washington. My presentation was to basically give you guys a brief background of the March on Washington. African American civil rights activists caused an uproar of overall rights for all Americans, and I also discuss the events that led up to the marches and what the results were. Learning about this significant point in history should make you more aware of how current civil rights issues relate to previous movements. My research tips and overview should have you guys have a better understanding of what we take for granted. Thank you.